my microphone on. I would propose a change to the agenda to drop those things dealing with short-term rentals because we still don't have the legislation amendments from the Office of Law.
Mr. Chair, would you entertain a motion to postpone action on O2619?
And 30 and 31, I think.
I'd second that. I was wondering if there was anything we're not covering at this Finance Committee meeting this morning.
And R30 and R31.
Right. And it's seconded. Is there any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
So, next item is approval of the regular meeting minutes from September 18th.
I did have the opportunity to review these, Mr. Chair, and they seem to be in order. I would move their approval.
I'll second it.
Any discussions? Hearing none. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Thank you again. Takia, before us now, do we have any financial things, Jody? Any essays and TAs and BA? Nope. Oh, good. All right. So we'll move right into legislation. First item on the agenda is CA 6-19. And as I recall, before this committee, there was a question about whether there was any increase in costs, which is relevant to this committee, by this shuffling of the players. And there was questions about increased costs for administrative help. At the Environmental Matters Committee, we had discussion on that, and it did not sound like there was any increase in administrative costs. Is there any new information on that?
May I have those emails back from them? Good morning, Teresa Sutherland, City Manager, along with Dr. Sally Nash, Acting Director of Planning and Zoning, Jackie Guile, Director of the Office of Environmental Policy, and David Gerald, Director of Public Works. I asked these three directors to make a list of the administrative functions that would fall under this department that are currently under their respective office or departments. So for the Office of Environmental Policy...
Excuse me, do we have that list?
You do not?
Okay, thank you.
For the Office of Environmental Policy, it will be in my staff report, revised staff report. The Office of Environmental Policy, Racine Hodo, who's currently the Environmental Program Coordinator, enters payroll. Both Racine and Brian Adams, the environmentalist, process invoices and purchase orders, and Brian enters permits into Trackit. And then the OEP staff does their own letters, citations, copying for meetings, scheduling, and prep for meetings. And the department...
Are those duties in their position description?
No. I think Racine's job duties, no, they're not in their current job descriptions, actually. They're not.
All right. Thank you.
In the Department of Public Works,
May I, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but I might.
Please.
So there are only 2 additional staff members in the department today? For some reason, I thought there were 3.
It's Director Guild, Brian Adams, and Racine Hodo.
Okay, so that, okay.
And there's no administrative person in that in that office right now.
Okay.
Okay? In the Department of Public Works, there's little administrative support related to the stormwater functions. An administrative person transfers outside telephone calls to the stormwater engineers and the compliance inspector, purchase office supplies as needed, and processes the payroll. The employees do the rest themselves, keeping their own records, entering into Trackit or iWorks, and developing their own spreadsheets, and preparing their own letters and correspondence, and managing their citation files. Planning and zoning gets a little hairier, so the tasks that are associated with the forest stand delineation and forest conservation plans, the applications are received at the permit counter and a fee is collected. It gets a file, a project number, and it's entered into Track It by the administrative staff. Currently, Tom Smith reviews it for completeness. The admin staff orders signs as needed for public meetings, hearings, and notice. Tom Smith makes signs and replacement signs to post on the property for the entire length of the process. Tom sends the applications out for agency review. Comments come in from the agencies, and either the plan requires revisions or it is approved. If it takes more than 3 times to get it right, the city hires a consultant to take over. There's a submission of a formal application, plan development, subdivision, site design, etc., which includes the forest conservation plan. Again, that's Tom Smith and the admin staff. Tom sends it out for agency review. Forest conservation plans require a public meeting that has to be advertised, so Tom coordinates making the signs and the notification requirements and holds the public meeting. Comments from the public meeting get included in response to the applicant along with other agency comments. That's handled by Tom. And revisions are required until preliminary approval. Final approval comes with the grading permit, and this is where Tom coordinates with the administrative staff and Matt Waters. And I'm going to let Sally address some of the confusion over who would be doing what if forest conservation plan and forest delineation are transferred to this new department, yet all of the other plan review processes remain under planning and zoning.
Okay, but before you do that, let me...
Am I going?
Yeah. Because Alderman Savage and I had a discussion with Tom and others about this, and I only speak for my druthers. I think this was at one of the Planning Commission meetings. It was at the Planning Commission meeting hearing on this. It is not my sense that Tom would be out of the Forest Conservation Act business, and in fact, it was my sense from him that he didn't want to be out of that business. I think this is more adding another set of eyes to it. Is that your sense? So, and I think these comments are more related to the ordinance 1819 than the charter amendment. Would they not be? So thank you for that information, and we definitely want to hear more from Dr. Nash. But
I'm sorry, you're just talking. Right now you're strictly focused on the charter amendment?
Well, that's the first item on the agenda.
I'm sorry. Then I take back everything I just said, and I won't repeat it when you get to 1819.
Okay, thank you. All right. So when we were discussing this, though, as a generic question, and I think it was you, Alderman Keown, who wanted to know if there was going to be any additional costs associated with the charter amendment and the moving of staff. And for your edification and Alderwoman Finlayson, there was a discussion at the Environmental Matters Committee, and at that point, the information we got was, no, this is simply, it's not even physically moving people, it's just moving their reporting lines, and the there was no additional administrative function. It is, to my mind, but I put this to the committee, for the Finance Committee, that's the issue before us. Are we increasing costs? And if we are, it seems to me we have to have an appropriation line to do that, which at this point I don't think we do, before things can go forward. But I put that out as an open question.
Alderman Arnett, may I offer a comment on that?
Certainly.
So all the charter amendment does is create the department.
Right.
What the duties of the department are created by the ordinance.
Okay.
Whether there's an additional cost is a result of the ordinance. And so while you may have had conversations with Tom Smith and he'd like to still have a role in forest conservation plans and forest delineation plans, under the ordinance, it will no longer be the Director of Planning and Zoning's responsibility, nor that department's responsibility, to be the one who reviews and signs off on those plans.
Right.
That will fall under the new department. So if that's the desire, then the ordinance needs to be amended, because that's
totally
not what the
agree with
ordinance
you.
does.
I totally agree with you. So, and that has been my position all along, has been that I want to see an environmental signature line on the approval processes from start to finish, wherever it's appropriate, not taking away the engineering aspect of Public Works or the adjudication of the Forest Conservation Act from planning and zoning. It is adding this additional lines, and the rationale behind that, and again, this is me, not anybody else, is the same kind of questions we've had with the stormwater management resolution, where we said we'd like to do more than the minimum, but our intent for that resolution was we wanted the staff to make that decision. Director Gerald has decided to make it a policy to up the ante on that. That's fine, but what we wanted was people with area expertise, like engineering, like how the water flows and what the amounts were, but we also wanted people who are looking at the environmental impacts of it, the TMDLs, the silt, all of those kinds of things as well. Now that's, again, my sense of this. That may not be anyone else's, or may not be 4 other people's sense of it. So, having said that, is there discussion about Charter Amendment 618?
May I?
Please.
618?
Nineteen.
CA 619.
Okay.
Ms. Sutherland, if we pass CA 619, in essence, it's a whole new section on the Department of the Environment. Then are we obligated to make all the changes that Alderman Arnett just said he's not in support of? And I agree with you. I guess, what obligation are we to the next piece of this? Do you understand what I'm asking?
If you create a department, you need to decide what that department's in charge of.
Right, which comes in the ordinance.
Correct.
Which comes in the ordinance.
Okay, so we could approve this to create the department, but then we could go back and fix the things or address the issues with the responsibilities of the department.
Right. I would only ask that you think that through, of how you're going to do that before you make a recommendation on either of them, so that your recommendations go hand in hand.
So you're saying we should take the ordinance before the charter amendment?
Or take them together.
Yeah, well, that's what we're in the process of doing.
I mean, I wouldn't, as the city manager, recommend that you vote in favor of a charter amendment to create a department without having a full understanding of what you think that department should do and a recommendation consistent with that.
Well, then, Mr. Chair, I think we should go to the ordinance, and if we're going to take them together, I mean, Ms. Sutherland was giving us information about the ordinance. We kind of put her on hold until we got to it. I think maybe we need to go back and look at the ordinance. I'm at a disadvantage today because I don't have my iPad. It was either be on time or go back home to get my iPad.
Right. I'll share with you in the.
And I'm reading to kids.
How does that
screen
strike
has
you?
pulled it up.
Alderman Pam.
Yeah. Waiting for her to go home and.
I'm done.
Yeah, right. Right. Yes. No, moving to the ordinance and coming back to the charter amendment.
Well, I think they're separate. It's separate legislation. I would recommend we take them separately. Take a few minutes longer, but not much.
All right. All right. So we still have before us CA 619. Do you have comments on that?
No, I mean, I'm supportive in general terms. The devil is sometimes in the details, and maybe I think the time for me to bring that out is when we do consider the ordinance.
Okay. All right. So we have, I guess my sense is the vote for when we're doing this is actually at the council and on the floor. We absolutely have to get to, and in fact, I want to get to the ordinance. But my sense is there's at least 2 votes to recommend approval of the charter amendment at this point. I think that if the ordinance gets changed to a point where I'm not comfortable with it, then I reserve the right to go back and vote no against the charter amendment at the council.
Well,
Gee, that sounds familiar.
and I'm not too far off. And that's why I asked the question. I could be comfortable with approving the charter amendment, but I'm going to have issues with the ordinance.
Yeah, me too.
And Ms. Sutherland has just recommended that we deal with the ordinance, which I'm comfortable doing. I don't think here it matters. I mean, we can take it out of order and
I would suggest that depending where your issues are with the ordinance and what you want done, for example, by planning and zoning versus someone signing off on environmental reviews or whatever it was, until you decide that, you don't know whether you need a department to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So first you need to decide what you want to accomplish and then decide what it takes to make that happen.
I guess I disagree. I think we do want a department, and the reason we want a department is because we've been told by the Office of Law it has to be a department other than being an office. We have an office now, and I was just fine with that. But if the Office of Law is saying, no, you need a department, then we need a charter amendment to do a
They're saying you need a department if you move the provisions from Title 14, Title 17, and Title 21
Right.
to be administered by someone else. It has to be administered by a department. But Alderman Arnett, I'm confused about whether you want the administration of those provisions to be by someone other than planning and zoning and public works. That's not clear. So that's why I'm saying
All right. Let's dispose of
depends what you want.
the charter amendment now, get to the ordinance, and then we can start making those things clear. We always have the right to come back and reconsider the charter amendment. So I would ask for a motion to approve the charter amendment and move on to the ordinance.
So moved.
Is there a second? I will second it. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain?
I'll abstain.
All right, thank you. All right, let's go to 01819. And this is voluminous. I see we all have in front of us a piece of paper. I don't know where this is coming from.
It's for me, Alderman Arnett. It's going to be, it's a section of my revised staff report that I intend to issue to the mayor on the legislation with suggested amendments that correct drafting errors in the ordinance. Those are all the bullets. And then in the last paragraph, I'm recommending that the ordinance be amended to take effect when the charter amendment takes effect.
All right, so can I, as an aside, it seems to me that we really do need to have the Office of Law here. It's the same holdup we're experiencing with the short-term rentals. We were told we need to have things drafted by the Office of Law in their format, not the format the amendments were offered. These are the Office of Law is what the people who wrote this. It wasn't any one of us. So
actually, it was Alderman Savage, and when Linda Schuett put it forth, she said that it did not have the review that she would like to have given it, but Alderman Savage wanted to introduce it by a certain date, as I recall.
She did review it, as well as Jacqueline.
Okay.
I have a document that has both their comments and legislation.
And I
but
haven't.
But the point is, I think, Mr. Chair, I'd recommend almost my 2 cents as the sponsor. I've not had a chance to review these. I'd almost recommend I don't know, at least waiting until the end of the discussion, maybe, because I think there's some, I'd hate to have this bogged down in the discussion. I think there are larger issues with the ordinance, it's questions, I should say, about the ordinance itself in terms of whether or not the committee, in terms of the discussions about costs. These amendments, I don't think, the city manager said they're not,
That's not me.
they don't change any policy. So I think they're not going to have an impact on the cost per se, that whole discussion. That's just my 2 cents.
So committee, and you don't even have it in front of you, but this is a gazillion pages, and a lot of it is,
Gobbledygook.
well, I mean, it's a strikeout and moving it someplace else, and
Yeah.
it is very hard to follow. I guess I would entertain some discussion of the general concept. As far as who strikes out and moves, I'm more than happy. I'm delighted to have the Office of Law do that if there's any things that need to be tweaked. But I'd like to talk about the general concepts of what the duties are that we would assign to this department should it be voted in by the council.
Well, Mr. Chair, we had requested that staff department heads be here for this discussion.
Right.
And so I would like to pose the question to Mr. Director Jarrell and Director Nash about how they feel this division of labor, I'll call it, is going to work with your departments and your responsibilities. We heard from Ms. Sutherland, Mr. Smith's role, and it seems all intertwined in what we're trying to do. So I guess from the directors, help us here. What works with this, what doesn't work, knowing what your authorities are in environmental oversight. Is that probably this, $64,000 question or far less?
So I guess I'll take a stab at that first. David Gerald, Director of Public Works. So I guess my view of this is that a few years ago, as you all know, because you were all here, DNEP was disestablished and some functions came over to Public Works and some functions went to Planning and Zoning from that DNEP dissolution. So my view is that those functions that came over, which is principally the stormwater management and two current positions, and other positions being added, but our stormwater engineer and our environmental compliance inspector came over to Public Works and they handle all of the reviews and all of the issues associated with stormwater. My view is that those two positions, and soon to be actually three positions, one is not filled, would move back over to the Department of Environment to do those same types of things. They're sort of a self-contained. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more clear for Public Works how this affects us. Those three positions would move back over to Jackie's department and do those same types of duties. The grading permits are actually issued by Planning and Zoning, so they review and provide comments, but ultimately the grading permits are approved by Planning and Zoning. Like I said, those positions are pretty self-contained. They don't get a lot of admin support from my department. They get a whole lot of management support, I can tell you that. But not so much admin support because they do those things themselves. They issue the citations, they do emails, they do reviews, mm-hmm. they put comments into Trackit. They do all those things themselves. So my admins and Public Works Administration don't do much support for them. Their phone calls come into our central number, so my admin staff routes those to them as needed. When they need office supplies, we purchase those through Public Works admin, so they help themselves to the office supplies, and we do the payrolls for them, so check and approve their time cards. But that's about it. Otherwise, they're pretty self-contained, and my view, again, is that those three positions would move over to the new department under the new Department of the Environment.
Would that impact your ability to sign off on any given project?
Well, we wouldn't have that sign off any longer. So we would have the sign off for grading permits as they affect the public right of way. We still review that. So I have an engineer separately that reviews all of those parts of a grading permit, but the stormwater management part of the grading permit would be still reviewed by Matt Waters and still commented on, and so that would all move to the Department of the Environment.
Okay, so stormwater could move over without any real impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's always impact on people, right? I mean, right now they're part of my engineering group, and they're comfortable in an engineering group because engineers are comfortable working with other engineers. So they would lose some of that support and some of that technical supervision and guidance that they get today. My staff would still be there, but they would be in a different department. So, you know, Sam Bryce, who's the supervisor for that group, would still be available to talk with Matt and the new stormwater engineer, but there wouldn't be the supervisory relationship there is today. So, but Matt didn't have that before when he was part of DNEP. So it's kind of reverting back to what it was a few years ago. But I can tell you that there's a bonus to having that relationship of him being part of a larger engineering group. He gets support and he gets backup and gets supervision and guidance that may be lost with the reorganization.
So a concern for me, Director Jarrell, is we don't want to fix, if you can use that word, something here and make a deficit someplace else. And I think this is going to be much more germane when we get to Dr. Nash. But if this happened, will you have some shortage of expertise or some kind of other deficit that would be a problem for the Department of Public Works?
No.
Okay.
Not that I can see. Matt handles all of those things related to it. When he's on vacation for an extended time, then some of my people back him up so things keep moving. But by adding a second stormwater engineer, that sort of resolves that issue that you've got to, and you don't let them both take extended vacations at the same time, right?
Okay.
But you can deal with that.
All right. Alderman Payon?
No questions.
Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment, clarification, I guess. So in terms of, I want to clarify what I'm proposing, and you know, I'm not proposing to cut out Public Works even from the stormwater process. They may not have the final sign-off, but they would still have a sign-off in the review process. You know, I'm even looking at just the existing code, which, you know, it says in stormwater management, it says, let's see, the department, which, you know, I'm going to propose to change to the environmental department. It'll say the department shall perform a comprehensive review of the stormwater management plans for each phase of the site design. Coordinated comments will be provided for each plan phase that reflects input from all appropriate agencies, including but not limited to Anne Arundel County Soil Conservation District and the Departments of Planning and Zoning and the Department of Public Works. All comments from other appropriate agencies shall be addressed and approval received at each phase of the project design before subsequent submissions.
And that's not changed by the ordinance?
Correct. The only thing that would change is the department. And that's really how it worked under DNEP, is that even for stormwater grading, even the forest conservation, other departments had a say. You know, grading permits, you know, fire department has review authority in the sense that they can make comments on it. I think it's the grading I'm thinking of, but building a permit too is reviewed by other agencies. So that's what I'm trying to carry over with the new department.
So if we could...
May I follow up with the question? Because I'm not clear. Director Jarrell said stormwater would move over, and he would still have a sign off on grading. So what is different about what you're saying?
It's the same thing, except I'm just saying that his staff, his department would still have an opportunity if they want to comment on stormwater, because there may be impacts on existing stormwater infrastructure, although Matt Waters, I suppose, would handle that as well, but there just may be other issues. It gives the departments an opportunity to comment on those plans.
So in what capacity, where would that take, how would that take place? I feel like we're creating I don't know, it's not a smooth
Can I
process.
amplify on that? Because I think what would be helpful at this point is to go back and do a postmortem on DNAP. Because you and I were here when it was created, and it was created to put an emphasis on the environment and a focus and a staff to do it. We were also here when it was proposed to get rid of it. And I think that part of what, for me at least, we're discovering is we probably shouldn't have gotten rid of it. Maybe we needed to modify it. I think that a lot of that had to do with issues that were not environmental and had to do with the political leader of the time and the policy of the time. Am I mischaracterizing anything, Alderman Savage, with that sort of brief summary of things?
No, but to Alderwoman's question, I guess what I can say to try to, and I know, I apologize because it makes sense to me because I've been through the process before as staff, but when you put in a permit, for example, a grading permit or a forest stand delineation or a forest conservation plan, you put the permit number and track it, and you put each of the departments that have a review on that. And so for grading permit, Director Gerald's right. So in the grading permit, which is when you review stormwater, each of those departments will have a comment ability, and so Director Gerald will be able to comment on anything related to the grading permit, be it, and then the same thing with forest conservation.
Can I stop you right there, though? Because, again, Director Gerald, I'm worried. I have so now we make this department exist and everybody's happy with the ordinance and everything else, and a grading permit comes in, and there is in code still some responsibility for public works. Who's going to do that now? If Matt Waters has moved over?
Yes, so again, we have two parts of the review of grading permits. One is the effect on the public right-of-way. So we have a different engineer that does all of those reviews, different than Matt. So that will continue. Matt will move over to the Department of the Environment, and he would do the stormwater management review. We would not, knowing Matt's doing it, it'd be silly for us to do that a second time. I mean, it's sort of a complex area. You have to, hydrology and hydraulics and understand the volumes, and you've had those discussions of what the state standards are, and they're not necessarily simple and straightforward. So Matt would do those in the new stormwater engineer. We would not do a second review of the stormwater.
But we're
management.
not leaving a deficit in your resources.
You only would if you still expected Public Works to do stormwater management reviews, because we don't. That's Matt. That's our resource right now.
Okay.
He's moving to still ask us to do that would be creating a deficit.
So if I may make this comment to my colleagues, one of the deficits that I think I am feeling, and you might be too, is I don't have a strong familiarization with the whole application process. Actually, Alderman Savage over Mexican lunch one day sort of walked me through, and I have a general knowledge of it, but I don't have a specific knowledge of it, and so it is hard for me to fully envision how all of the moving parts and when people show up and when they sign off and when they go away and so forth. And that's, for me, and maybe for you too, why it's hard to grapple with an ordinance as voluminous as this ordinance is, and not, I mean, I understand strikeouts, and I understand new language, but I'm not sure I have a full awareness of how it is impacting the process. We do know that this change worked in the past, at least to some degree, because we had it in the past with DNAP. And I think really de facto what we're doing, maybe in an improved version, is recreating DNAP. I think this is kind of under the last administration, we made a mistake. We rushed to judgment. We weren't fully thinking it through. And we don't have the kinds of emphasis that we wanted on the environment when DNAP was created, actually under the Moyer administration. So that's where I am. The nuts and bolts, it's not my area of expertise.
Mr. Chair, and I think that is exactly why we have the department heads here with us.
Exactly.
To give us their professional knowledge, because we don't know.
So perhaps it's now time to hear from Dr. Nash.
If I might, I hadn't intended to hand any of this out. I will also give you the first 2 pages of my draft revised staff report. It lays out, for example, the ordinance moves all regulations in Chapter 1710, Stormwater Management, to Title 19. Moves all regulations in 1708, Grading, Erosion, and Sediment Control, to Title 19. So it's just a little walkway for you of this is where it is now and this is where it will be.
Right.
I think Public Works has given us probably, as David, Mr. Director Gerald said, the easier department to deal with. Now we'll hear from Dr. Nash.
I do want to do that, but before I do, I want to hearken back to the role of this committee, because it seems to me that we're crossing over into the role of your committee.
Rules Committee.
Rules Committee. What we really should be thinking about here is, frankly, not the nuts and bolts of the legislation, but the financial impacts. We need to know whether this change is going to require more resources. I think Alderman Payon, you were right in focusing on this at the last Finance Committee meeting. I'm more than happy for us to get into some of the details, because as council members we're going to have to get into it too, but I am thinking that you're right, Fred.
I still can't get over it.
Memorialize
Alderman
that.
Payon was right.
Fred Payon was right.
Every now and then he's right.
Just wanna make sure
It's
I
like
heard that.
happened before. But
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how we can figure out what it's going to cost until we figure out what we're going to do.
I think that's,
all right. Well, I think that gives me some guidance in as far as what to say, because I have a lot to say about reforming DNAP, but I'll just start with the financial issues. So this would basically, as far as financing goes, I'm assuming everything pretty much works the way it does now, with planning and zoning taking in the application, distributing it to the different agencies. I'm a little confused as to how the final approval process would work. If we're not the final approval, maybe we aren't the ones taking in the application, because that doesn't really make sense. I think the department that has final approval should be the one taking in the applications and distributing them. But those are details. But basically, as far as the amount of staff time Tom spends on this, it's significant for the applications. We don't have that many applications for forest stand delineations, forest conservation plans. But for each individual application, it is a substantial amount of time. And like Director Gerald was saying, I wouldn't think it would make sense for Tom to spend the same amount of time he does now on an application replicated with the work of if there is a Department of the Environment. It wouldn't make sense for 2 people to be doing that level of in-depth review and analysis. The main problem with that is that Tom can't quite help but need to do that level of review, because forest conservation is part and parcel to site design. You really have to think of the whole site and the impacts of the site, not just on the trees, but the soils, the hydrology, the placement of the building. It's also interconnected that, it wouldn't, he's pretty much going to have to do that level of review anyway. So I would see having someone else in the Office of or Department of Environment, that would be kind of a duplicative function, and that is what happened basically in DNEP with Frank Biba and Tom Smith. They, arguably Tom Smith always did a more in-depth review, but that to me would be an additional amount of staff time that would need to be spent on forest conservation. So that's a cost. Our time is a cost, and that is what pops out to me. I think it would also be confusing for our admin staff in terms of coordinating who, the approvals. We have a system now. But, as from a financial point of view, I don't think our department is going to be impacted, that much. I think the bigger impact would be the increased administrative needs for the Department of the Environment, which I know Jackie is very efficient and does things very well, but I know from firsthand experience that is very difficult to not have enough admin support and to have to do those things yourselves. I mean, I remember when Jane, our director, our assistant to the director position was eliminated in the budget, and my staff was answering phone calls and helping people who walked in the door and scheduling meetings and
making up posters.
It was very difficult. It was the last time I was acting director. It was harder than it is now to be acting director, because now I have a lot more admin support from the department formerly known as DNEP. So I would just like to point that out, that is very difficult to manage.
So that's very helpful to me, and I do want to dig into something that doesn't have to do with the finance stuff, and probably we will get back to when this goes to rules and city government. But you mentioned, and I'd forgotten the relationship between Frank and Tom, and I always thought that was a fairly productive relationship, and I would like to see that same kind of relationship exist still. And again, at the Planning Commission meeting, Tom indicated, one of the things that Tom said that struck home to me is he spent a lot of time building up expertise on Forest Conservation Act, and he didn't want to see that go away, and neither do I. And I've always viewed on the permit process, my understanding of it, which may be primitive, is it is planning and planning and zoning. That's where the people come in, they submit it, and planning and zoning handles it. It can be handing off or getting things handed in, and I don't have any desire to see that change at all. So from a resource perspective, if we're doing, which is my gut sense, we want to keep Tom in this process, are we now saying that we need another resource a la a Frank Biba type of resource that's in the Department of the Environment that would be that complement, that cohort that reestablishes that relationship?
Well, there's no... Okay, well, first of all, one of the rationales for dismantling DNEP was to create streamlining for the review process. So the question is, do we need two people reviewing these plans? As spending in-depth review of these plans. Right. I think Tom welcomes input and is certainly happy to get input from Brian and Racine, and he does loop them in on the bigger projects. But the question is, who's going to spend the bulk of his or her time on this? Before, I know when Pete Gotwell was here, he had proposed moving Brian to planning and zoning because that would help. That could be help to Tom in reviewing these projects. It could also help reviewing other projects, other tree removal issues. But in a way, it doesn't matter because we do work closely with Brian when applicable. So we could, always expand his role if he. I'm not sure what his background is for forest conservation, but I don't think you need two people doing an in-depth review, but I think it does need to be clear who is going to do it. As far as the issuing the permits, I just mentioned that because I'm sure we can figure it out, but I just don't understand how it would work if the Department of the Environment has the final approval. Then we wouldn't issue the permit. Isn't that the case? So I don't.
No, and that's what bothers me because it feels like we keep trying to make this be an either or. And what I feel is that it needs to be an and. That what we need, just like when we were talking about stormwater management, and I remember very vividly when Matt Waters was talking to us about the project on West Street and how it was a redevelopment project, and we were squeezing every single thing we could do out of that project just to meet the bare minimum. And that's when he showed us the charts that showed the stormwater for different levels of rain and so on. It was very enlightening about the process. And at that time, I formed this notion that there's a straight basic engineering, how many inches of rain, what kind of flow, where does it go kind of thing. And then there was another discipline, which is the things that are getting carried away with that flow are nutrients, are silt, those sorts of things, which are outside. I mean, they clearly are engineering in terms of the physics of it, but the impacts of it were things that were over in another purview. And
so you would just imagine that the Department of the Environment is added as someone who reviews our permits and projects along with our other agencies?
Part of the process at the table with a signature line.
So they, like when we get a site design review, we send it to Fire Marshal's office. Mm-hmm. They sign off. They usually say, like, you'll need this, this, and this when you come in for a building permit.
Right.
So you're saying it would work like that, where we would also send it to the Department of the Environment, and they would say, make sure to consider this, this, and this.
Yes.
And then it would come back to planning and zoning. We would approve it as we are now. Okay. Right. I don't think that's clear in the ordinance, or at least that's not what I understood. Well, it may not be,
but that's what we'll be looking at. We really are concerned from this committee with our charge, whether or not there's enough resources, and part of resources is staff, part of resources, therefore, is appropriation, so forth. So far, what I've heard from both you and Director Gerald is not a big resource impact. I still am worried that we have enough people, but that's more you tell us, not. And of course, we need to hear from Director Guile too. But so far from the Finance Committee, I'm not hearing things where we have to be saying we can't approve this because we don't have enough resources, or we can approve this as long as we, in the next budget, put in an appropriation line or hire another staff person or whatever. For the Rules Committee, I'm hearing a lot of things that I think we need to get into, but for Finance, I'm not.
Well, Mrs. Chair, I'm still not clear on how we're going to take responsibility from two departments, put them in a third department. DPW Director Gerald said the 3 engineers are a block, so they could move easily. I didn't hear that in planning and zoning.
No, I didn't either.
And so where does the staffing responsibility lie?
Perhaps now Jackie can,
So I think what I heard is that you're saying that Director Gerald and Director Nash didn't identify a fiscal impact on their departments, which is true because, for example, the whole stormwater engineers and the inspector move, as do the responsibilities. What I heard David say is there isn't much administrative functions related to that, but there are management functions related to that, where the engineers work with the engineers. And what I'm hearing Dr. Nash say is Tom Smith, in his position, still has, to do these reviews and things because it's so integrated. So I don't think the impact is on these two departments, it's on the new department. Because if, for example, Brian Adams would now have the responsibility of review and sign-off authority on all forest conservation and all forest delineation, assuming he's got a full-time job right now doing his current duties, and now you add all those duties, how does one person get all that work done? And is it duplicative with what they're already doing in planning and zoning? And if you move all of those functions over, depending who takes in the permits, who posts whatever has to be posted, that kind of thing, if that all falls on the new department, is there a staffing issue? So I don't think the staffing issues are with planning and zoning and public works. The staffing issue is, will there be a staffing issue in the new department?
so I think we're about to get there, and we'll talk to Jackie next, but let me just say, in fact, the question I have for you, Dr. Nash, is who's going to be the new Tom? Because it is a considerable amount of expertise. I'm hoping that there's somebody already being groomed or, second in command to look at the Forest Conservation Act. And we know from all the stuff in the news about the county and all the trees that they've cut down, this is a very important issue. This is a huge issue in the environmental world, over and above or in addition to in the planning world and the permitting world. So again, I see this not as either or, but and I think we'll let Jackie get to whether we need something else in that department. But
Well, may I finish my
of course, please.
thought?
Sorry.
Because, and I think you've kind of gotten Dr. Nash prepared to answer it. How does your staff and the responsibilities in your department get divvied up? Planning and zoning was easy. Tom Smith can't be in two places, and he's earned the, he's acquired the experiences necessary to do what he does. But he's not going to leave your department.
Correct.
So how does that work get done? Why would we have a duplication, having him do half the work and some unknown? How does that work? How does that work in your mind? Or does it? Maybe it doesn't work, and that's fine too.
Well, I think that Director Guile can speak to the expertise of her staff. I'm not really familiar if she has staff. I think she does have some staff who's at least, as Alderman Arnett said, being groomed to be able to take over forest conservation. Whether it's worth duplicating the process, I think that's a policy issue that affects the time it takes a permit to get approved, the cost of staff time. That's up to you guys. And so, I would just say that it's hard on staff to be reorganized a lot. So I would put a plug in for not reorganizing us anymore. But again, that's a policy issue and up to you. So.
Okay.
Back to us. Thanks.
Yep. Just Alderman Savage, and then we'll get to Director Giles.
Thank you. And I'm certainly open to any kind of suggestions, improvements that staff would recommend for the process, because the ordinance doesn't, like I've said before, I tried not to change any kind of policy per se or the process. I kind of just carried it over and changed the department names. And I think that's essentially what happened when DNUP was dissolved. So I was kind of assuming that the same process could be carried over. But I don't see it about duplication of effort. I see it as more just cooperation and combining different backgrounds. But at the same time, having the environmental reviews being driven by, in the forest conservation sense, being driven by an environmental scientist and arborist who's under the umbrella of an environmental department. Because I think, granted, when DNUP was here, we did work a lot with Tom, and Tom did have a, Jan was kind of, who was the forester, was kind of the one in control of the forest conservation plan. Well, him and Frank, but they got comments from myself, and we often sat down with Tom and got comments on the projects. And I see that as continuing. At least that's my vision. But I think it is all. I do kind of hope this would help to offload some of the responsibilities from Tom and from the other planners, so they can focus on site design. Because I don't see it as being completely integrated. It is a part of site design, but I also think it's a little separate because I think it does involve the environmental science, the review of the forest and delineation, which is more of an objective determination of what the resources are out there, which is not, again, something that's clearly linked to the site
Tom Smith is a
design.
landscape architect of many years of experience, and I think I would like to have him, maybe I'll have him come to Rules to talk about how integrated it is with site design and everything that he looks at.
That would be great.
I also think if you don't want to duplicate, my point with the duplication is who has the final approval authority. It doesn't matter to me where it is, but my point is that it wouldn't make sense for, I'd say, either then keep all of it under the purview of planning and zoning and say we have to have Department of the Environment as a reviewer. Then to me that feels less duplicative than the other way around. But that was just my point with the duplication, because I do believe that Tom will need to continue to do an in-depth review of that, and I don't see how it will save us any time to have the Department of the Environment have the approval authority, or that to be under those regulations to be under them. I don't see that a environmental scientist is going to see forest delineations and forest conservation plans any differently than a landscape architect who's a qualified professional and has done this for many years. You know what I mean? It's just that it is what it is. It's not. And if he does miss something, then fine, we'll get their review comments, and then we can incorporate that.
But I think
can I jump in here,
Sure.
though? Because we keep mixing up approval authority and final approval authority. To me, final approval authority has always been either the Director of Planning and Zoning or the Planning Commission, depending upon the
For
project.
forest conservation?
Well, for
That's-
a project. So,
Okay, but that's not how it is in the ordinance.
well, then maybe that's something we need to be enlightened on and fix. But
Okay.
what I've thought the process is all along is it's a timeline. And it stops at various places along the way, and people look at it. So like the fire marshal looks at it, and the fire marshal checks off water pressure is okay, and the X number of sprinklers per square foot, whatever all of those things are. And other people do it too. So, but the final authority as opposed to an authority line. So let me just ask you a question. If a project is going through the thing, through its paces, and the fire marshal says, I'm not going to sign off because I don't think this has meets the proper requirements, the project stops there, right?
That's right.
It cannot move forward. And
That's
so
right.
if someone says, I'm not going to sign off because it doesn't do the proper things for stormwater management, it stops
That's
there.
right.
And it goes back to the applicant, and they have to address it. But the final decision is with the Director of Planning and Zoning or the Planning Commission, depending upon the project. So once it finally gets through all of the things, the grading permits, all of those things, final is different than being able to stop the bus along the way, right?
Right.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I think even with fire and stormwater, those departments, currently Public Works and the fire department, have regulatory authority under those sections of code to do that sign off. And so for me, it's more than just about the sign off. If you give the Department of the Environment a sign off, I think that needs to have that regulatory authority, and I think just simply giving them that line doesn't necessarily do that. They have to be given that authority underneath the code, which is what I'm trying to do. Through the ordinance, which is what I'm trying to do. And if there's a way to make that clear, I'm certainly open to it. But again, to go back to the issue of Tom's involvement versus environmental scientists, it's kind of similar to my reasoning with creating the department. Is I feel like having somebody focused solely on these responsibilities, be it environmental, stormwater, forest conservation, brings forward added additional benefits, right? That person is thinking about those issues all the time with their review, where Tom, I know he sees it as very important, but he has a lot of other things to factor in with the site design review.
I know, but I think if you look back on the last 20 years of the projects that Planning and Zoning has approved, we've gotten so many acres of conservation easements. We've gotten people to do stormwater practices that they would never have imagined of doing. I mean, our track record, I think, speaks to the fact that we are very well equipped to do that, to do those reviews.
I'm not arguing against that, but that happened underneath DNEP for 15 years, and P&Z did not have the final regulatory authority under those programs. DNEP did.
Right,
so, I mean,
but now we're talking about what are we going to remake DNEP?
I'm saying, if it worked under DNEP and you made all those accomplishments, why would it not work underneath the new department?
Well, then I would say to you, then why did we go through all the turmoil of dismantling DNEP and then
that's a question
to remake
for them.
it? I mean, to me, that is,
On the financial impact.
but in any case, I get your point, and it's probably an issue of how it is worded in the ordinance as far as who has ultimate
But
approval.
again, that's essentially how it was worded under DNEP. I didn't change the way I just changed the department responsibilities. So if it worked under DNEP, that's what I'm assuming it should work now. But if there are further tweaks to be made, then sure.
Right, I'll have to look at it again, because my first reading of the ordinance was that Department of Environment would have final sign-off on landscape plans and forest conservation plans and things like that. And that is where a lot of my confusion comes into play.
I think they should over forest conservation plan, but landscape plans, if they're part of the grading permit or site design,
landscape plans are part of the forest conservation approval.
Well, but they go along with the grading permit.
Can I interject a point of personal privilege? I turn into a pumpkin at noon, and we've had this whole discussion, and we haven't heard from Jackie yet. I would really like to hear from her. I think what's going to happen here, and I've just consulted with my colleagues, we're not seeing any financial impact as presented here, but we don't know what's going to happen when it goes to rules and we refine things further. So I think what we're going to recommend, and I'm suggesting this right now to both of them, is that we not take action pending what happens at the Rules Committee, because if the Rules Committee, like this whole issue about Tom's work and then how Forstin from the environmental thing gets worked in, does give me the sense that there may need to be, maybe Brian Adams can handle this all, but maybe not. And that's one of the things that I really want to pursue. Now, I'm perfectly willing to approve devoting more resources to this, but I think we need to know what this is before we can get to that point. So, Jackie, could you give us your observations of what has transpired so far?
So I'd like to address the Tom Smith versus Brian Adams, not versus, that's not, Brian conjunction, them in combination issue first. So what Tom does is a function that very much belongs in planning and zoning. He's doing site design, looking at the developer's proposed plan, and as part of that, he needs to understand what trees need to be conserved, which are specimen trees, which are historically important trees, and where the wetlands are, and he does the whole forest conservation analysis. That is something that he needs to do as part of his analysis in order to develop a site plan. It was a little ambiguous to me as to where final authority would go, but I still see final authority probably because the site design incorporates all those forest elements still residing within planning and zoning. However, Brian Adams would not be duplicating in Tom's work at all, but he is our city arborist, and they do communicate now. Tom does consult with Brian, and I think that's a very necessary part of the work and should continue. I do think that since we have a city arborist and someone with so many credentials and so much experience as an arborist, and that's all he focuses on are trees, that makes sense for that environmental lens from a city arborist to be, I mean, we call him the environmentalist right now, that's his title in the code. That should be changed. He should be called the city arborist or city forester. But that person should be looking at the trees and that part of it on a site design. So when it's ready, when Tom has a draft plan, that should be bumped to Brian for that tree-specific analysis, applying the Forest Conservation Act, which Brian is very, very familiar with. And in fact, I asked Brian if he had a certification to do that sort of work, and he said it's something he asked Maria Broadbent for, but she did not approve. He currently, right now, is going through the class. I think it's an 8-week class. He goes several times a week at night to get that particular certification. He already understands the act and how to apply it, but he doesn't have the certification. So I thought it was important that he does have that certification, and even more so now, if he was under the code, given a responsibility for review, I think that's an important certification to have, to say to a developer, we had the city forester or arborist with that sort of particular certification look at it, in conjunction with our landscape architect, who also has looked at it, and together, this is what they agree. And but also, Brian, it would be important, just like a stormwater review that David's referring to, if Matt Waters says there are problems here, he bounces it back, he identifies those problems and bounces it back to the developer to address. At that step of the process where Brian had his review, he would say there are problems here, and they would have to be addressed by the developer, or he would say this meets all Forest Conservation Act and other requirements. Right now, what Brian does, I just want to add on what he does, it was ambiguous who was supposed to be doing this. DNEP used to do the bond inspections on the trees, but that was transferred to planning and zoning. Pete Gutwald asked me last year if we would take that back, and I consulted with Brian, and he said he would. So Brian does already do the bond inspections to make sure that the right trees, the type of species, the type of size were planted per the site plans that were under the permit that were specified, and that they have also were of good quality and are still surviving. They have to survive for a year.
So let me see if I can repeat back to you what I think I heard. And I'm thinking of this in terms of a Venn diagram where we have overlapping circles. So Tom would do the site design analysis, and part of that would be the forestry, the Forest Conservation Act, and how many trees are we cutting down, and are we cutting down specimen trees, and those sorts of things. Brian has responsibility for our overall tree canopy goal. He also has knowledge of forestry and those sorts of things. So like, you can have 100 trees on a parcel and not have a forest, depending upon how they're clumped and what's in the undergrowth and all of that. So, and I'm sure Tom knows about that as well, but we would want Brian or whoever the person is doing that to speak to that, and would be looking at those things independent of applications in the city, and could be looking at places like when we're doing a stream restoration, would be looking at, gee, this is an opportunity to get some invasive species out and more concentration of these kinds of trees. So to me, there is an overlap, And I agree with you, Sally, if it's a big overlap, then we've got a redundancy. But if it's tangential and cooperative, then I don't think we do. And I think we want both. We want somebody who's going to be mindful of the overall tree canopy, mindful of opportunities to get things in and other things out when we're working on projects. So did I capture what you were saying correctly?
Yes. So it's currently is a cooperative effort that should continue, but Brian should be given that review step and approval step. Then if it doesn't meet it, goes back to the developer
Right.
to correct that. But Tom is overall still responsible for that site design process and working with the developer to get it right.
So on a particular project, Tom would
Go ahead.
Tom would go through saying things are in the right place, we've complied, and Brian could say, yes, but there's an opportunity here to put more trees or a different kind of tree or do something that affects the overall canopy goal, which again, I know Tom has in mind, but it's a different. So what I'm looking for is the value added for this department or office, whatever it is people who are looking beyond specific projects to overall goals, TMDL goals, WIP projects, all of those things, but also on an individual project has a place where they say, yeah, this is going to be helpful for our tree canopy goal, yes or no, we're missing a big opportunity to do this, so can we go back to the applicant and talk about this before we move forward with the project? And I don't know, Rob, if that's where you are or not, but that's where I've been all along. And I don't care how we get it done or what we call the group. I do care if we have enough people doing this and enough certifications and enough other resources, and that would bring it back to this body if we need more, or if we need, because Brian gets these certifications, he's now eligible for a higher level of pay, fine, that's a thing that has to get into the budget, and it's a use of resources. So, Alderwoman, you were going to say something?
I think you addressed the what was being said, or what I was thinking about saying.
I'm sorry, then.
So that's okay. That's okay. I do have one final comment, but I'll wait until we
Okay,
finish.
so was there more, Jackie, that you wanted to?
No, unless
Okay.
you have specific
All right.
questions.
Okay. Alderman Savage?
No, I agree with you. I think if we can accomplish having that sign off and opportunity for an environmental department to have the regulatory authority to have that sign off in the forest conservation process, I think that's the direction I want to go. And if that means, so I'm going to go back and take a look at that section of the code and maybe chat with the law office and see if it may need to get adjusted to make it clear, and chat with Dr. Nash about.
City manager, does this help you in your, because you have to manage all of this, does this help you in your thinking about what we're trying to achieve as policy goals, and will it help shape your report that you're giving us?
So I will write my revised staff report to the mayor because, as I explained, I think at your last meeting, the original staff report was based on the mayor's proposed reorganization versus this bill. You all did not vote in favor of the mayor's proposed reorganization, so it revises the staff report, revises the possible fiscal impact. It is my position as the city manager that if we wanted the city forester to have review and approval authority, it would be more appropriate to move that position into planning and zoning, which is what the mayor's reorganization proposed. You all don't agree with that, so I will manage it however you see fit. I am concerned about assuming that Brian already has a full-time job, that he is already busy all the time with his existing duties. If you now add forest conservation and forest delineation stand review and approval to his plate, is that too much for one person to do? Would be a question I have. And then is there any administrative office support type of help needed?
All right, thank you, and I share that concern.
Yeah.
I do. And I think that brings it back into the purview of this committee. If we do need to have more resources, and resources are a trade-off, we get one more dollop of forestry, we have one less resource to go to fire or whatever. And of course, that is your job to coordinate and advise on all of that stuff. Our job is to take the budget that you and the mayor develop and make sure that it has the policy priorities that we want in it. But still, I think I have that inkling of the same concern that you expressed about whether we don't need more resources to do what we're looking to do from a policy perspective. And I think after Rules does its work, we hopefully will have a better sense of that. So I would entertain a motion from the Finance Committee that we defer action on our recommendation until after we've received a report from the Rules and City Government on the actual nuts and bolts of the ordinance.
Well, I'll make the motion, and then I want to speak to your last comment.
Okay.
I'll second the motion. I don't have any problem going forward on the charter amendment today, but the other one, I think it needs more work.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Well, it's going back to the final comment that the city manager was making about Brian already having a full-time job, and Tom is already doing the job. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we have a process that works, and I
don't agree with that.
Well, okay, because you've got specific issues too. But I would just like to remind staff, this was very personal when DNET was eliminated.
A lot of it was, yes.
And it was nasty, it was ugly, and it was unprofessional in my view. And I don't want to see any inklings of that ever again. And I know that there has been name calling and just unprofessional behavior. And I would call on the city manager to make sure that our department heads and others work at a standard that is appropriate for our city.
I think they do, but
Well,
we want to
no,
continue.
because we hear nasty, and we shouldn't hear nasty. So I'm just
All right.
saying. So I've gotten that out of my system.
All right,
So,
so we-
Mr. Chair, I already made the motion,
And it's been seconded, Alderman Savage.
and it's been seconded.
I was just thinking it might be a good question for Director Gild about if Director Gild, if Brian Adams, if Mr. Adams did get sign off, does he have the room in his position as it is to provide that?
Well, it just depends on what level of sign-off you're asking to do. If Tom's already done the forest conservation plan and delineation, he's asking him for review, Brian doesn't have to redo it all over again. He does have to review it, and his recommendations would be, once he looks at the computations, would be more into where the trees are being grouped, quality of what they're planting, what types of planting should be going in, and any other very tree-related urban canopy, other things like that he might recommend. So I don't see it as, it should not be a duplication of effort. The ordinance should be worded in that way so that it's not. But he does have a full plate now. He believes that some of the bond inspections could be performed by a compliance inspector.
Okay, that's mine.
So if they went out and said, okay, they have the right number of trees, the right size, and they're still alive, and highlight anything that they think that the city forester should look at.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that actually, because I forgot that it was one of my intentions of moving over the environmental compliance inspector. Because when I was in that position, I did used to help out with forest inspections, did the sediment control, I did the climate responsibility, sustainability was half my job, and then I did all the others. Occasionally, Jan and I would help out Cynthia with critical area. So there was but that position was really narrowed down to only sediment control currently. So I think to allow that to do some of those other inspections would be helpful.
Okay.
Right. The one problem with that is that our inspectors sometimes specific trees were required in specific vegetation, and our inspectors don't always know what to look for. They can tell if a tree is alive or dead, but they can't necessarily tell what kind of tree it is, and we've had issues with that in the past.
I wanted to take a second to recognize a statement that you made, Dr. Nash. I fully, having experienced it many times in my federal career, I don't think moving people around is something that should be done lightly, and I think people do count, and I know you believe that. Both of you do. So we're taking a lot of time on this, and that is something we need to ask the city manager about. Are we timing out on this legislation? Do we have to introduce it to postpone it? But I take your point that there are Venn diagrams and theoretical things that we're talking about, but they're people that do the job, so we shouldn't be cavalier about this. I didn't want to let that go by.
And I would just suggest that there are people whose plates are already full. So if you put additional duties on the forester position, but you take some of these inspection duties away from the forester and put them on the environmental control inspector, is that what it's called? Compliance inspector, that person already has a full plate too. So
I hear you, but I'd like to know more, but when I was the compliance inspector, that was 50% of my job, and I was helping out with forest stuff too. But now it's 100% of his job is doing the sediment control. So I find it hard to believe there's no room for him to do more
and I'll raise the
responsibilities.
issue again that you don't seem to like me raising, but if the environmental compliance inspector is paid out of the watershed restoration fund, unless these other duties directly support our compliance with TMDL, MS4, all the things that you just put in the purposes of the watershed fund, then that portion of that person's work would have to be paid for out of the general fund.
Okay, I'm about ready to turn into a pumpkin. We have a motion that has been seconded, which is to defer action on this until we hear from the Rules Committee. We have the Rules Committee all here present, so everybody knows what's expected of the Rules Committee. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Thank you all. It was very helpful for me, I think, for the committee. Fortunately, we're probably going to ask you to do it all over again in front of rules, but we've heard a lot of it, so I hope we've been making progress on this. So thank you for being here and helping us.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make one announcement. I am wearing my sweatshirt. I had physical therapy, but this is my sweatshirt today. It is the breast cancer awareness fundraiser that our fire department does each year in October, and so I encourage you all to go out. If you haven't gotten your t-shirt or your sweatshirt, go and get it.
Oh yeah, your knee is great.
Well, I'm still working on it. I'm in therapy. So support our fire department. Give them a call and tell them you want a shirt or two. Buy one for the whole family. It's an excellent cause. It's October. Thank you.
Great. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
We do.
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I hope you enjoyed yourself, Jody. Sorry, but
Okay.